Good. Good. Let's go ahead and begin. I want to welcome you all to the Montague Barker Lecture Series. And I'm very pleased to have as our speaker, Yinxuan Huang. And Yinxuan Huang of both members of OCGC and work with that church. But Yinxuan Huang is also a research fellow and coordinator for Bible and the Chinese Community Research Project at the London School of Theology, which ran from 2021 to 2022 and continues to work in translation work and also with Bible translators. His main research interests are in Chinese Christianity, East Asian diasporic communities, and survey methodology. Yinxuan is also youth coordinator at the local OCGC, which is an Oxford Chinese Gospel Church, of which we have the pastor here and associate pastor here. So well represented. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. I'm going to get up the PowerPoint so you can see that. All right, and get that playing. We got there, and I will speak this over there. So there we go. And stand kind of at an angle. So yeah, that's me. We'll just cursor right and cursor left.
Hey, thank you very much, Tom. Hello, everybody.
Let me just check. Can everybody hear Yinxuan? Are we okay? All right. You might want to turn a little bit more and speak to this way a little bit because we can hear you pretty good in the room.
Yeah. Otherwise, you'll see my hair loss problem. But anyway, thank you so much for having me. And I've been knowing OCMS for a long time. It's great to be here in person for the first time. So like what Tom said, what I'm going to talk about today is this project called the Bible and the Chinese Community in Britain. And there are many data and things we collected from the project, but specifically I would like to talk about this theme about spirituality, unity, and division today. So a brief outline of what we are expecting today. So I'll start with a brief introduction of the history and background of the Chinese Christian community in the UK. And I will proceed with introducing you what this project, the BCCB project, is all about.
I'm going to pause. Yeah. I want you to move here.
Yeah.
And I want you to stand right here because I can see what they're seeing and it's just barely your shoulder. So go ahead and move that chair out of the way and right now speak. And then we can turn this towards you. There we go. So that you can see. Oh, okay. We'll just take a second to get this straight, and we will. Okay. The video. Or one of the video. Okay. Yeah. So should I go to this? Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah, and then we'll pin it right here. Okay. Pin. Okay, and then that should do it. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. Now we can see you trying.
Thank you again. Well, that's the impact of this post-COVID era, which we're going to cover in this presentation. And yes, so what the BCCB project is, followed by this research design, what we did, and in terms of data collection. And like I say, there are many things we found about the Chinese Christian community in the UK. And I would like to focus specifically on three what I call vignettes, the three storylines that I think are particularly interesting and important in this day and age. Yes, let's start with history and background. Very brief history about the post-World War II Chinese immigration in the Chinese church. Well, if you look at the history of Chinese immigration to the UK, it actually can be traced back to early 19th century when the Imperial Britain is expanding, and many Chinese seamen actually joined and helped that process. But if you look at the post-World War II period, which is of course more recent, We can talk about this story from 1950s, where the first ever Chinese church was established in London. It's called the Chinese Christian Church in London by Reverend Yinxuan Huang. And after that, we have the first wave or the first generation of Chinese churches, which are usually called the CCCs. Now, a very interesting thing in the Chinese church here in Britain, if you go to a city and see a CCC, like a Chinese Christian Church, that mentions the Chinese Christian Church, also a Chinese Christian Church. Whenever you see a CCC, it's probably the very first Chinese church established in that city. And there are also, of course, churches called different names. These are usually new, often results of church split in the recent 2 decades. Just take Oxford, for example. We have an OCCC, Oxford Chinese Christian Church, and we have also our own very Oxford Chinese Gospel Church, which was actually resulted from a church split about 10 years ago. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong. And so from 1950s to the late 1970s, we have the very first one of the churches, which are often built by Cantonese-speaking immigrants from Hong Kong. They were usually labor workers, some are restaurant owners. But from the 1980s, things changed slightly. This is an era where the UK has introduced a selective migration policy, especially towards people from East Asia. And we have, in the meantime, the first wave of political migrants alongside international students, young professionals from East Asia. There are a number of serious political incidents happening in Asia around that period. We have the open door policy of China, very early time coming out of the Cultural Revolution. We have the Tiananmen Squares in 1989 with government crackdown protesting students. And of course, in 1997, over of Hong Kong to the UK. So all these resulted in a large wave of immigrants. But rather than all immigrants from Hong Kong, the previous Commonwealth area, that wave was more diverse and more dynamic. And we also had the first wave of Mandarin-speaking Chinese churches established during that period. And from the year 2000, another key factor happened was the internationalization of UK higher education. So more and more Chinese students from mainland China come to the UK. And that was the time when the Mandarin-speaking ministry started to thrive. And many more Mandarin-speaking Chinese churches started to emerge in the UK. And about 2 years ago, 2021, there's another big change in the UK, not religious one, but rather a political one. So if you're familiar with East Asian politics, that was the time when there was a series of large protests in Hong Kong, the anti-extradition deal protest. It was the protest that people organized to protesting the stronger government hands from the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to Hong Kong. So a direct result of this is the introduction of the national security law in Hong Kong, which forced many Hong Kong people to flee Hong Kong, worrying about political situations. Now, the most popular destination of them is actually UK. So the UK government introduced the British National Overseas Route for Hong Kong people to arrive and settle in the UK in mid-2021. And that has resulted in a large wave of migration. And we are at a very critical historic juncture at the moment. So like I said, there are many social political issues happening in Asia, pushing these migrants to the UK, COVID, US-China trade war, and politics in East Asia. And most importantly, we're experiencing a very significant Hong Kong phenomenon. So by the end of January this year, there has been nearly 150,000 migrants coming from Hong Kong ever since the Vienna route was opened in mid-2021. And the number is still increasing. So some government statistics, like the ONS, predicted that by the end of this year, there could be nearly 200,000 migrants coming to the UK. So number-wise, this is the single largest mission field we're experiencing in recent decades. And of course, if you remember, just now I mentioned that from the early 21st century, the Mandarin-speaking ministry, which is largely underpinned by migrants from mainland China, Mandarin-speaking, is developing. But now we are actually facing a reshuffling because of the incoming Hong Kong migrants in recent 2 years. And because the time period is so short, this impact is actually very, very significant. Now, a very big picture of the Chinese population here in the UK. Well, unfortunately, the new 2021 census data hadn't released this cross table of ethnicity and religion yet, but we can use another the second largest to the census, which is the recent annual population survey, consisting of about 300,000 people. So if you look at that data, Chinese Christians present about a 23% of the population of the whole Chinese population in England, Wales, and Scotland. And not surprisingly, no religion is still the biggest category there. But if we compare Christian population of the Chinese people here in the UK to East Asia, it's bigger than mainland China, 5%, 12% in Hong Kong, and also 4% in Taiwan. So interestingly, the overseas Chinese Christian population is actually more prosperous, if you like, than those in East Asian societies. Now, a few words about the Bible and Chinese community in Britain, aka the BCCB project. So it was initiated in 2021, May 2021, by the British Foreign Bible Society, and that was commissioned to London School of Theology. So it's not an entirely academic project, as you can imagine, but we still started everything from an academic way. So I came from a sociological background, having studied sociology of religion, obtained my PhD in religious studies. So academically, we would really like to conduct a very rigorous academic study to develop a very expansive understanding, and not only sociological or theological, but interdisciplinary conversation about Christianity in Britain. Well, interestingly, although the first Chinese church has been built for over 70 years, there was no single systematic study of this Christian society in Britain in the past 70 years. And empirically, we would like to capture this very unique moment of history and essentially to collect data and to establish a research network consisting with scholars, mission agencies, and also Chinese churches in the UK. And as part of the bigger vision of the Bible Society, we would also like to contribute whatever we have to this great Chinese mission, the expanding mission here, and to use whatever we find, the study, the data, to serve the churches and actually all those who are engaged with the Chinese ministry. And like I said earlier, to really foster the conversation and try to explore together how we can better serve the expanding Chinese ministry. So before we go into the research details and our findings, there are two caveats we should realize. The first is, how do we define Chinese? It's actually easier if we say that concept in Chinese than in English, because in Chinese, when we say you're Chinese, it can mean different things. Now, two main prominent examples are number one, Huaren, if you speak Chinese, which means overseas Han Chinese. And another prominent usage can be 中国人, which means Chinese national, Chinese citizen from mainland China. So in this study, Chinese is being used as an ethnic concept. So when we say Chinese, we mean all Han, all Chinese of Han Chinese birth or descent. That can mean migrants from East Asia, or those local British-born Chinese. And in order to do this study, we need to also define and measure religion, and in this case, Christianity. So I am from a sociological background, which means I care about how religion, and in this case, Christianity, how that is socially constructed, how it interacts with our society, and from an individual point of view, how that defines your relationship with God, your relationship and identity within the church, and your attitudes and behavior in the wider community. So I borrowed a idea from Yinxuan Huang, which actually sees the Chinese church as a sort of market. And like all religious market, the important thing about the market is it needs to has its customers. People have to make choice. People will have the experience and moments. They are adhesive, as what he called adhesive experiences in the church. And by that, the adhesive Chinese Christian market can be divided into 4 categories, which I think is very useful when it comes to measurement. Okay, the first is called spiritual. The spiritual dimension, including the spirituality, private, communal practice, and also religious beliefs. The second, which is quite important in the Chinese case, is political. As we can see, the whole immigration, migration wave we spoke about, much of it is actually about politics. So how we view politics, governments, all these things happening around us affecting our lives. It's the second significant dimension. And there's also a cultural dimension about Chineseness. By saying you're Christian, Chinese Christian, are you primarily Chinese or are you primarily Christian? That's another issue we're interested in. The last bit is the social. We imagine that this Chinese church is a family and it consists of different domains of relationships with their peers, with family, and with God. So, when it comes to the overseas Chinese Christian community research, we have much more evidence in North America than in Europe. There are different reasons behind this. There aren't many researchers really go into this. And personally, I think the biggest reason is if you don't have money, you can't do anything, right? But recently, there are more and more, there's actually a growing body of research into this. Well, most of them are academic PhD research, which is not that big in terms of scale. Some of them are very unique. For example, studying how practicing Christians take on political issues or social integration. But we are in a wave that not only immigrants are coming, but also academic studies as well. So conceptually, if you look at those studies, mainly in North America, Chinese is often described as an ethnic enclave, somehow segregated and constructed upon transnational networks embedded in contact with not only here, but also in contact with sending countries and the relationships and networks established in the hosting country. And lots of things can be discussed here. That there are language, culture, relationships. But the central claim of this ethnic enclave is that Chinese community is rather defined by a bright boundary of this Chinese versus others idea. But what I like to propose and what I like to do in this research is that we should probably test the hypothesis of British exceptionalism, especially given this very unique period of time where all the migrants from Hong Kong predominantly chose UK as their destination, or nearly 150,000 people coming in less than 2 years. It must have some very important and significant impact on this very mission of God in the UK. So what I would like to propose is that we do a very specific research on the UK, seeing what's going on in the UK, what impacts are. And this is actually what motivated the BCCB project. So moving on to our research design, what I tried to do is I used a mixed method in terms of research, consisting of both quantitative bit and qualitative bit. And the logic we follow is what we call deductive simultaneous design, where the main component is quantitative, and we use the qualitative bit as the supplementals. There are three main components in the data collection. The first component is secondary data analysis, where we use prominent data sets, secondary data, to mainly establish a big picture of the Chinese Christian community. There are 3 sets of data. we use. The first is government data, including mainly the Home Office border records, where we can trace the fluidity of migration. And the second is the 2011 and 2021 UK census. There are also other prominent large social surveys we can use in the UK. The two I use is Annual Population Survey, which is the largest in the UK, and also the Understanding Society, which is the largest longitudinal data set in Europe. And the third one, we also use some private data that are usually not big in scale, but quite unique in terms of their forms and characteristics. So one is our Bible Society Lumina project, which can be used as a prototype of the BCCB. And I've also used Peter Briley, you know who he is, a very prominent UK scholar working on Christianity in numbers. And meanwhile, we also try to use some spatial data where we can locate where the church buildings are, where the group is located, and where are all those migrants moving to. So one example is the church directory, sponsored by Herald UK. And the main component of the first hand data collection is a web survey. I'll describe that later, which was also inspired by 14 pilot interviews with church leaders and directors of major organizations in the UK. The last component is qualitative analysis, which is mainly consisting of 45 semi-structured interviews with church leaders. Well, apart from that, we also conducted 6 interviews with theological students and theological educators to search for their responses to this Chinese ministry. And also there are 3 ongoing focus groups focusing on the churchgoers, Chinese churchgoers. But we only focus on the interviews with church leaders today. Now, moving on first to the survey on life and faith of the Chinese community in Britain. It's a trilingual web survey, English, traditional Chinese, targeting Cantonese-speaking people and Taiwanese, and also the simplified version, which mainly targets mainland Chinese. So it's collected from the end of 2021 to early 2022. Now, it uses what's called a center sample technique. So one issue that you always have to face when researching small minority religious groups is that you don't have a sampling frame. You don't know where they are, they're scattered everywhere. So how can you collect data which are more or less representative? You can have a clearer and valid idea of what is going on in that minority. So here is why center sampling is very useful. So imagine, if you are Chinese people living in different areas, you have different political opinion. Some use smartphones, some don't. Some speak Cantonese, some speak Mandarin. It's very hard to bring them together. The Chinese community is actually more diverse than we think. Now, in this case, where do you think are the places that you can find all these people without bias, without discrimination? Any idea?
It's the grocery stores.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you can see on the left, we put our flyers into two main locations, supermarkets and Chinese restaurants and takeaways. These are probably the 2 places you can, no matter like Chinese government or not, you need to be Chinese food, right? And you need Chinese groceries. So you just go there. So we reached out to about 6 Chinese supermarkets in London, Chinatown, Manchester, mainly in these larger, more populous city in terms of Chinese population. Meanwhile, we also contacted some local Chinese communities. We have local Chinese neighborhood centers. Chopstick Club is a business club, business network of Chinese entrepreneurs. British Chinese Heritage Center, which is a group of language tutors, which is actually part of Middlesex University. And also there are a number of local Chinese language communities and supporting communities, which we turn to. And the second, these are basically the groups we can find the general sample. And also, of course, we are interested in Chinese Christians themselves. So we also collected a booster sample targeting mainly the Chinese church-going Chinese Christians. And that was the time we started conversation with these large mission organizations like COCM. And also was also supported by a group of Anglican communities with East Asian and Southeast Asian heritage, so including the Tea House, which is a group of Anglican priests of Chinese and East Asian backgrounds. We have Anglican Minority Ethnic Network. And, you know, the one thing I can't emphasize enough is that in order to do research in the Chinese Christian church, you need to have 关系 in Chinese, you have relationships. Now, as a sociologist, I've worked with radical feminists, homeless people, illegal migrants. You know, the key about researching these people is you need to gather. When we say data collection, the core of data collection is you need to gather truth. You need to somehow trick them into giving you their true feelings, their true thoughts. And I must say, compare with these three groups of people, getting true feelings from church leaders and church people are even more difficult. You laugh, so probably you imagine why, right? So one thing you always face is inflation. People tend to say good things about themselves. Well, I'm in trouble. Is your church having any problems? Well, yes, but God is in control. Then it's very important. So in the data collection, you create a good relationship. So what I did, and I had to, is to take an insider-outsider stance. So if you're familiar with qualitative study, you know, you're an insider, so you can trust. You're an outsider, because when you really collect data, you don't speak for the church. You speak as an objective, you speak from an objective point of view. So I've been serving the Chinese for 10 years. That's a gift from God, and I'm grateful to that. That's why, you know, I've got people trusting me. But also, when I was really there collecting the data, and ask all these critical questions. And, you know, it's black that most of them are less protective of themselves when answering these questions. So the survey, if you can look at this picture, and this is a map where it shows you the amount of data we collect in each region of the UK. So most of the data we had are from the Greater London area. We have also some more data from Liverpool and Manchester. So if you look at this picture, interestingly, it basically shows you the HS2 line. The reason is that Chinese migrants are very economically minded. So what they will usually do is they will gather in places where you have higher opportunities to get a job, better education opportunities, better wage. So basically, you can find more Chinese immigrants in these larger cities with more job opportunities, and also reflected in our data collection as well. So basically, we have a general sample from supermarkets, grocery stores. There are nearly 800 of them. 19% of them are Christians. So it's similar to the 2011 census, which shows 18.9% of Chinese are Christians. And we also have a booster sample from different Chinese churches and Chinese congregations, local Chinese congregations, where we have 350 Christians and 13 non-Christians in these locations. Now, as you can see, because we have a booster sample, we have more focus on Christianity. This sample is actually, I must say, more representative of Christians, not only Christians, but also church-going Christians. So I'm lamenting about inflated, but I have to admit, somehow this survey is a little bit inflated and towards the Christian side. So when it comes to the interview, we have 45 interviews with Christian leaders, focusing on different dimensions of their life stories, basically. The impact of COVID-19, perhaps more importantly, as a recent issue, the BNO arrivals, opportunities and challenges they're facing, and their personal reflections, their spirituality, needs, and well-being. And 6 additional interviews with theological students and educators, which we will probably not cover today. Now, to the 3 linears we just moved. Let's move first to the changing landscape, the changing big picture of Chinese Christianity. So this is a projection based on Peter Briley and John Hayward's research a couple of years ago. So basically I used the same data, but did a little projection according to recent census. So what you will see is in the UK, and I must mention this as well. So this is a story we're all familiar with. The new census, less than 50% of the country are a Christian population. But if you look at the red lines showing growth, blue lines showing decrease, what you'll see is that mainly those pre-1900 traditional mainstream churches are decreasing, whereas you have some minority and especially Pentecostal churches on the rise. The question is, what about we put the Chinese church into this graph? And you'll probably see something like this. So if you look at the Chinese church from the, I forgot to mention this. So basically in the research program, also did a 74, what we call church census interview. So this is basically, I reach out to church leaders, asking them about the members, the changing registration of members, changing numbers of regular attendance in the church. So based on the 47 interviews, which covered more than 1/3 of Chinese Christian churches and groups in the UK, we can see that the growth is nearly 90% in the past 2 years. And I mean, this is huge, not surprising, but if you're first to see this, you might think, wow, this must have something really, really special here. Now, one example I always would like to say is Manchester Alliance Church, which had about 180 members pre-COVID. Now, the last time I spoke to them, they 2 months ago, they had about 2,200. So it's increased over tenfold. However, we should interpret this story really carefully. Because I mentioned a number of times, this wave of large migration is about Hong Kong, right? Which are mainly Cantonese-speaking Chinese people. So one question we ask about, we ask the 74 church leaders is that, just look at your church, compare your church to 2019, before COVID. How does it change? Is it getting bigger or smaller? So if you look at the Cantonese, so if you're familiar with the Chinese church here, it usually has 3 pillars: Cantonese speaking, Mandarin speaking, and English speaking. So if we look at here, the purple one and the blue one, which shows you growth, you can see that the Cantonese speaking, mainly Hong Kong background churches are really growing. Over 3 in 4 experienced slightly and significant growth, especially 3 out of 5 experienced significant growth. By significant, I mean the church size growth over 50%, right? That's what we call significant growth defined in this survey. But if you look at then the Mandarin speaking, the English speaking side, the story is really different. So if you look at the English speaking side, it's actually somehow shrinking as compared to the pre-COVID level. Somewhat similar story when it comes to the Mandarin speaking. So when we talk about growth, it's really a story about Hong Kong background Chinese Christianity, not about the other two, right? Now, why this is the case? One significant reason from a sociological perspective is the significant social function of churches. Ever since this migration started, there are different programs helping new comers from Hong Kong to settle in this country. I like to say much of this initiative is a Christian one. So the 2 most important things going on here is one, there's this Hong Kong Ready Church initiative. So since 2021, there are nearly 700 British churches signed for this initiative. So basically, when you sign for the Hong Kong Ready, sign as a Hong Kong Ready Church, you would join this welcome course, which is a course to help Hong Kong people, better integrate the local community, and then you will also provide essential information that they need so that they can have a better life in from how to register with the NHS, how to find a local school, how to rent from different Christian gatherings, Bible study groups, and friendship festivals. So all of these events, if you're a Hong Kong people coming to the UK and you are part of these events, which you usually will be, you can see a church background. You can always find a link to the church through these events. So it's not surprising that you can actually find many more Hong Kong people in not only Chinese church, but local indigenous churches. So finally, about this big picture, this is a graph showing you the Chinese church and Christian groups by denomination in the UK. So when I first came to Britain 10 years ago, in Herald UK, it shows that there are about 138 Chinese churches and congregations. That's the statistics of, I can't remember exactly, it's probably 2011 or 2012, 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. Today, there are at least 110 of them. And most of these were actually developed within the last 2 years. So if you look at the Chinese churches here in the UK, most of them would describe themselves as non-denominational and even non-denominational. And CCCs are these early churches, and others, most of the others are what I say, the second or the third church in the city. So, but if we combine those CCCs and others, you'll see most of the Chinese churches are non-denominational. They don't belong to any denomination. Partly because early founding father of these churches, like Yinxuan Huang, they're from more or less Baptist background, which is an independent congregation. And for those others who are joining a denomination, you can see there are Methodists, and there's a big growth in Elim Church in the past 2 years. So 3 years ago, there were just 3 Elim congregations in the UK. Now there are 12. So Pentecostalism, Chinese Pentecostalism is also growing worldwide, and UK as part of this story. Another one, which I should probably not put it as nested churches, what I call nested churches. These are churches, Chinese churches, which are part of a local indigenous church. So we mentioned the UK, was the UK Hong Kong Ready Initiative. And also, most of these are Anglican churches. So nested churches are different from like a Chinese church. They rent Anglican church for 2 hours Sunday morning. They went there and they went back. Not like that. So nested churches are more organic. They're part of the host church as well. They would have a whole congregation gathering, Chinese plus local British all together on an at least monthly basis. So these churches are growing rapidly in the past 2 years. There were probably just 2 or 3 of them in the UK 2 years ago. HTB, St. Helens in Bishopgate in London, and probably less than that. So one of the new phenomena we can observe, there are also new Hong Kong churches. And 2 years ago, if you say Chinese church, you probably mean Chinese church. But now, in the last 2 years, you will see more who they brand themselves as Hong Kong church. They purposely distance themselves from the word Chinese and indicate that we're from Hong Kong. We want nothing to do with Chinese, okay? We'll talk about these Hong Kong churches later. But what we'll see here is Chinese churches are pretty decentralized. You will not see any organization that represent all Chinese churches in the UK. They're mainly decentralized, but it's also very diverse and dynamic. Diverse in the sense that there are still denominations, there's still different traditions people can follow. And dynamic, of course, because of the rapid growth of immigration from Hong Kong. We're seeing new developments these days. And not only the church, the Hong Kong church is getting nested, is interacting more with the local churches. And this idea of ethnic inclusion is also changing in recent years because we see more interaction between local Chinese churches and the outside world, the wider Christian community. So interestingly, when the Franklin Graham, he came to the UK to do this God Loves You tour, which caused much controversy, if you can remember. When they were preparing for a legal fight and also preparing their next tour, which will probably happen in July this year, they were actually hosted by a local Chinese church in Liverpool. They have their office and all the teams located in this All Nations Hub in Liverpool, which, by the way, is a Chinese church, but it also has a prominent Farsi-speaking Iranian congregation and a Portuguese congregation. So we're seeing changes rather than you see a bright boundary between Chinese and non-Chinese. But perhaps thanks to COVID, they are getting together at the moment. And this is not a separate case. We see similar cases in London, in Manchester, and in Scotland as well. So yeah, very quickly, Chinese Christianity is not only growing in person, right? The online community is also growing rapidly. So when I first started the research in 2020, there were about 83 Facebook, Instagram, YouTube channels. It was collected by, these are recorded by a software called Sprout Media. So it automatically counted the keywords and the key group names on the social media. There are 83 in 2020 in May, and by August last year, it has doubled. Now, the second picture I want to talk about the spiritual profile of Chinese people, because spirituality is the key of the research, and we can know more about Chinese, not only Chinese Christian, but also the general Chinese population in terms of how they practice religion, how they perceive religion. So if we first look at Chinese Christians in the UK, we can see that in terms of both private practice and communal practice, they are really devoted if we compare that to the general, even the church-going population in the UK. If you take these populations from prominent surveys like in the Standing Society and Bible Society's Luminal. So if you focus on, if you ask the respondents in our survey, Christian respondents, how often do you pray, which is alongside with Bible reading is a typical measures for private practice, and also church attendance and small group attendance is measures for communal practice. In all these categories, they score pretty high. And pray alone, 78%, church attendance weekly, 87%, and also over 70% attend small group gathering on a weekly basis. And in terms of Bible, when we ask them, what do you think the Bible is? There are basically 5 categories you can choose. Bible being the actual word of God and should be taken literally, word by word. The Bible is the inspired word of God and has no errors, although some verses are meant to be symbolic rather than literal. These 2 are usually what we call the high view of the Bible. So Chinese people, as you can see, the red and yellow ones, represented the great majority of the population. And again, if you compare this with Luminal, similar study on the British population, the gap is about 25%. So it's really, really tells you how Chinese people feel about the Bible. And also, 86% of Chinese Christians read or listen to the Bible at least once a week, which, compared to 61% of church-going Christians in the UK, according to Luminal. So if we also look at the Chinese, non-Christian Chinese, showed this picture earlier, showing you almost 2/3 of the Chinese population, Chinese people here, say they have no religion. But this non-religious nuns population really have to be defined very carefully. Again, another question we ask them is, do you believe in the following supernatural stuff? Heaven, hell, gods or the supreme beings, and also reincarnation, all these supranational elements. You can see actually there are more people answer yes than no. And these are all, by the way, these are all religious nuns in the survey. So, as a matter of fact, it's not that the Chinese are atheists by saying, you know, I have no religion. They're actually quite open. And you can see they're actually thinking about the supernatural or godly things in their minds, which again, for missional agencies is something we can work on as well. Okay, and
Wow.
I think it's a bit frozen on the screen as well, but anyway. Right, so another interesting element we would like to discover is how Chinese Christians differ from others in terms of this attitudes and behavior outside the church. And of course, one prominent thing we can talk about is the same-sex marriage and abortion, which are very popular topics nowadays. And if you look at the picture, you can see that Chinese Christians tend to be extremely conservative.
Yeah.
And most of the great majority of what we ask, they are opposing, not, I can't say opposing, but they are on the negative side of opinions regarding same-sex marriage and abortion, which is very indicative of conservative views. And this is not only, you can see not only a gap between Chinese Christians and other UK population, but also even within the Chinese group, they are quite different from others. Now, the very last bit I would like to present is the what I call constant borders of the Chinese Christian market. So one thing we would always like to explore is how people make decisions when they come to church and which churches they would like to go. So we ask a very simple question in our survey, also in our interviews: is which church do you want to go? Do you want to go? Do you prefer to go to a Chinese church, or do you prefer to go a local church, British church? We start with this very simple question. We also add some further questions, but just for today, we'll focus on this very question. Now, before we answer this question, I need to show you something else, because when it comes to church choice, it's not about spirituality, only about spirituality. It's also about lots of other things, as we see in that adhesive choice theory. It's also about the political views, culture, and relationships. So one thing I think is very important, especially for the past few years, is our perception of China, this big beast, if you like, in East Asia. How do you really see China? So here you can see several groups. So HKC means Hong Kong Chinese, C means Christian, and C means non-Christian. So this is pretty detailed categorization. So we have pre-2021 Hong Kong is the earlier immigrants before the BNO route. And the post-2021, most of these are BNO arrivals. So anyway, what we can see here is that for Mandarin-speaking Chinese and British-born Chinese, especially if you look at the mainland Mandarin-speaking Chinese, which are mainly from mainland China, their opinion about the rise of China in the past 40 years have been really positive as compared to the others, and Christians, non-Christians alike. You can see a big gap of polarization even in terms of views about China in the past few years, especially if you look at post-2021 Hong Kong people. Again, Christian, non-Christian alike, their view of China, which is technically on paper, their master country, is really negative. This is, I have to say, not surprising, because otherwise they wouldn't have moved to the UK anyway. Now, another key issue in all kinds of marketing theory is you need trust to be part of a group. So trust about other people is really something very important when we look at the choice, all right? So what we see here is that we ask a number of questions to all respondents, is that, do you think these groups of people can be trusted? Do you think Hong Kong Chinese can be trusted? Mainland Chinese can be trusted, and white British can be trusted? Interestingly, you will see that as Chinese, we think white British are most trustworthy. And especially for Hong Kong, the new Hong Kong migrants, they think mainland Chinese people, which is orange here, simply not trustworthy. That also explain, why many Hong Kong people, they actually, as we'll see later, they do not only come to the UK, they come to the UK to avoid local Chinese communities. And remember these gaps, because I think these are really important when we look at how people look at people's experience with church, Christian encounter. So this will not only explain the issue from a spiritual perspective, but also from a very important, subtle social perspective. Now, what we like to see is how people make the choice, which church they go to. So from here, you can see in our survey, about 75% say they go to a Chinese church, they prefer to go to a Chinese church. About 25% say they prefer to go to a non-Chinese church. And this is what we call a sneaky chart. It basically shows you in a given population how likely the Hong Kong migrants are going to the Chinese church and how likely they're going to a non-Chinese church. And for example, this one shows you, the large proportion of the Hong Kong pre-2021 population will go to a Chinese church. A smaller percent will choose to go to a non-Chinese church. And remember, these results are part of a series of multivariate econometric modeling. So we control variables for age, gender, marriage, occupation, and English proficiency. So when we read this, it's basically when we say if a person's or group's age, gender, marriage, occupation, English proficiency are on the same level, how likely their ethnic background will determine where they go. Okay, so what we see here is that when everything's controlled,
Don't touch them though.
okay, I won't. Okay.
You can point.
I know medicine. Now, the mainland Chinese are more likely, the middle one, are going to a Chinese church as compared to the Hong Kong migrants and also BBC and other Chinese. And if you look at the Hong Kong ones, if you compare them, the new one to the older generation, the new ones are actually about 30% more likely to choose to go to a non-Chinese church. But there are also many other interesting things we can find if we answer this question. Now, religiosity. So religiosity, let's put it here. So religiosity is measured by a number of determinants here. So we have private and communal practice, religious affiliation. It basically shows how devoted you are when it comes to practicing Christianity. What we see here is that across the three levels of religiosity, high, medium, and low, the differences are not very significant. Same amount would go, same rates are presented in across the three levels. But if you look at perception of China, this is quite amazing. So if you disagree, China makes me proud, you're much more likely than the bottom one, agree with China makes me proud, to go to a non-Chinese church. Similar stories with first and church destination. If you believe the mainland Chinese, you can't be too careful, you're also more likely to go to a non-Chinese church. The same with mainland Chinese can be trusted, so that will result in a higher likelihood to end up in a Chinese church. So when it comes to white British, the comparison is even sharper. So if you think white British can be trusted, more likely to go to a non-Chinese church, whereas if you think you can't be too careful, then you're much more likely to end up in a Chinese church. Now, in social psychology, this is a typical example of what we call hunkering away. So the hunkering away theory basically says if you are experiencing a loyalty problem within your own community, usually underpinned by a problem, trust, lack of normal reciprocity, autism, you're more likely, to distance yourself from the neighbors in the community and try to find somewhere else. You find your a new sense of belonging. And this seems to be the case especially in the Hong Kong community at the moment. Now, I mentioned the new Hong Kong churches, none of them very new. The first one established in winter 2011 in Edinburgh. It's called the Hong Kong Christian Church in the United Kingdom. Now, like I said, like 3 years ago, you wouldn't find a Hong Kong church in the UK. So there's something really new. But if you read their mission statement, it has something extraordinary here. It says, we focus ourselves on studying the Bible so as to follow the steps of Jesus Christ. After the year of 2019 in Hong Kong, we decided to dedicate ourselves to show our faith through our daily life, to do justly and love mercy, to speak the truth and reject every lie. And you're familiar with the Chinese, the narratives in Hong Kong in recent years. It's a very clear, loud political claim. Basically says I'm against CCP, I'm pro-democracy. And now there are 5 HKCC UK church in the UK, and there are also this branch called Good Neighbours Church. Usually they were planted in larger cities, Edinburgh, Sheffield, Manchester, and London, and Birmingham as well. So these churches are quite unique, not only in terms of ideology, but they're also quite unique in terms of what they brought into the UK, because they are bringing a brand new system. So for me, that actually creates problems as well, because there's such a prominent example. As a researcher, you have to get engaged with them, right? So I wrote them numerous emails, countless WhatsApp messages even. Nobody replied. It makes me very, very sad. So I actually asked one friend, which is part of that church actually, what's going on here? And she replied, very, very simple. Sorry, not this one. So I'm not surprised at all, I'm not offended, but even your name presents a problem. Because I'm from a mainland Chinese background, so they can tell from my name that you're from mainland China. So again, people are cautious like that. So at the end of the day, I managed to talk to one of them in Edinburgh, one of the founding members of the HKCC church. So he said exactly, but the thing is, when you really started the conversation, it looked really genuine and nice. But the thing is that fear that was created in the collective experience in Asia actually were brought here to the UK as well. So that again says the Chinese church is really in transnational church. It's not only about their life here, the collective memories, experiences, what you have experienced in Hong Kong in this case, really affected your life here. So it's really a fluid relationship rather than a snapshot, all right? And another interesting thing we will find that despite these private dialogues we talk about all the time, we still pretty much, the Chinese pretty much treat this as a taboo question. Now, one of the stories that motivated us to do this research was an early study I did in early 2020, which was about, not about Chinese church, but about how UK communities react to, Chinese communities react to the COVID. But in 3 occasions, I heard 3 similar stories talking about the same thing. It was so appalling from Christian perspective. So basically, it went like this. In 3 separate locations, 3 separate Chinese churches, the Mandarin-speaking congregation, the Cantonese-speaking congregation refused to pray and stay with each other. And even on social media, one of the pastors showed me a message saying, one side cursing the other side. You know what? Because you are pro or against CCP, you definitely go directly to hell. And I will, at the end of the day, sitting next to God and enjoying watching you burning in hell. And it's as bad as that. Now it's getting better these days, but people are still, church leaders are still very cautious when it comes to these issues. So whereas, privately, we all know these are very important things that shaping the future of the Chinese church. It's pretty much still treated as a taboo question in the Chinese church because leaders were worrying about the consequences. It might cause split and might cause deeper conflicts within the church. So you can see a very interesting contradiction here. On the one hand, the future of the Chinese church is based pretty much on these cultural, political, and social issues. But on the other hand, these are not addressed almost at all on the pulpit. So a very quick conclusion. I think we can possibly, if you want, describe the Chinese church in very short terms. It can be summarized as a 4D church. It's very dynamic, fast-growing, transnational. It's very decentralized. Every church has its unique story. We don't have many denominations, and we have new denominations as well. And people are very devoted on different levels, but in the meantime, we can see that devotion is often linked with a quite conservative and one-way dimension of spirituality. And yeah, of course, it is diverse. We have to acknowledge these are people from different backgrounds, standing contract different denominations. And as we can see, socio-demographic spiritual characteristics are also quite different. And in terms of unity and division, we can see some brighter boundaries. We can also see some dissolving boundaries. The brighter boundaries are quite interestingly, mainly not an outside outward looking one, but an internal emerging boundary within the community. There's a trust crisis, there's a conflicting conflicts of work views and political views. So one broad observation, a hypothesis I would like to propose is that in the long run, the Chinese church will experience a big split from a Chinese church, a unified Chinese church, to a Chinese church, a group of Chinese churches and a group of Hong Kong churches. You can see that the prototype of these splits is ongoing at the moment. But in the meantime, there's also dissolving boundaries, and it's mainly blurred boundaries between the traditional ethnic enclave theory, where we have Chinese versus others. And we can see that this boundary is getting lighter because more Chinese, especially new migrants, are mingled very well with local churches. I've spoken to 7 and 8 Anglican ministers, local British ministers. They all say that they're somehow thankful for the Chinese migrants because that basically saved their church. Now, before they come, especially in those more, I won't say remote, but traditionally not very popular areas for Chinese migrants like Kent or Wales. But because there are so many people coming, some Hong Kong people, they try to go to these more less populous areas to find housing to settle down. And these places were usually quite bothered by the aging problem of the church. But they are also helped by these large migrants because those new migrants fill their churches. So I've got one minister told me he had to deal with a congregation of 7 people, all aged above 70. But now they have like 50. So this is really making a new period of history. And the BCCB, you have to know that it only provides a snapshot because we are doing a cross-section study rather than longitudinal. And that's why I think this is why we treat it as a baseline study. We would like to bring in more conversations, not only with academics, and also with church leaders and organizations, so we can, in the long term, continue to explore what's going on here. Okay, I'll stop here.
Well, let's put our hands together. All the windows, so you can see that from there. We probably want to leave the shared screen up because people might want to ask about specific. If you want to ask a question of Yinxuan, on the bottom, for those of you that are joining by Zoom, at the bottom there's a little button called reactions, and if you push on that and then push raise your hand, then I'll see your hand, and then I will recognize you. You can unmute and ask Yinxuan a question. I have a real basic question. In your surveys, did you ask what the vocational backgrounds of the people you were surveying? Because my suspicion is, and this is just from experience, is that a lot of people coming from Hong Kong now with the new wave are just people in different walks of life. They have jobs, that kind of thing, come over here looking for employment. They may be in business, other things. Whereas the great majority of those that I meet that are mainland Chinese come as overseas scholars who come in to do research or studies or are attached to academic families. Is that in any way match up with what you've seen, or did you not look at that aspect?
Well, I think there are two reflections to that. So number one, remember we're still in this era of selective migration, all right? So even BNO migrants, you need money to come here.
Yeah.
There's a financial criteria. So I don't have it in my own data, but the BBC did a survey. Over 30% of new Hong Kong BNO arrivals are millionaires, and 70% of them are upper middle class in Hong Kong. Now, this is not that, it doesn't look actually like what we might imagine by the first instance, because lots of them actually sold their houses to come here. Of course, they're millionaires. Why do they sell their houses? They are not sure whether they can find a job here. In my focus group, which I didn't present today, I've met lawyers who work as a muscle clerks in the Chinese supermarket, because language is always a problem. And as a lawyer, you need new certificates in the UK. And we are in recession at the moment. There aren't many jobs available, in the market, but most of them came here with relatively. I didn't ask for occupational attainment, but if you look at occupational attainment is less indicative of their true situation. Some of them just arrived, maybe 2 months or even a few weeks when they did the survey. But educational attainment is more relevant, and educational attainment is usually very correlated to your occupational results. So most of these migrants from Hong Kong are really well educated. So I need to double check, but I remember 70% of them have degree or above educational qualifications.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I was really struck by your comment about cultural political division so sharp in the church that it inhibits discipleship for pastors to teach and disciple. Could you just expound a little more on that, how that inhibits discipleship?
Right. I mean, number one, at least now, it's not a problem at all. The reason is that if you have so many migrants coming to your church, you have seen countless stories about my church doubled, my church tripled. My church, Manchester Lion Church, increased by 10-fold. You have to worry about numbers. No, you don't. So, in a sense that when church leaders, especially when there are so many people coming in, and you are so busy with pastoring and catering their needs, you care less about their political views as long as they can stay here. So the whole point of the Chinese discipleship, disciple making is a very particular meaning, which is I should get you to serve. I should get you to be a solid long-term member of the church. Why? Because Chinese church, even now, it has a very significant problem, which is lack of pastoral resources. There aren't many pastors, especially now. On average, in an average church, one pastor serves. That's a statistic I read recently. On average, one pastor would serve about 50 to 60 people. In the Chinese church, it's 1 to about 120. It's really a large gap. So what do you do about it? You have to get more lay leaders to try to help. And that's what discipleship means. But before you get these disciples, you have to make sure that they come to your church and you can make them stay in your church so they can serve with you in a fellowship for the long time. But now this is largely not a problem for many churches because people keep coming in. And that's why, I made a comment on Christianity Today a few months ago. I think, despite the large influx, evangelism is pretty much dead in the church. We don't have to do anything. This is what I call passive evangelism. Because people coming into your church, why do you have to worry about numbers? You don't have to worry about that anymore. What you worry is about they would leave if you say something that makes them unhappy. This is a worry about of lots of pastors. They all know the issue. They all know that privately people are struggling with these, and they would like to address these issues. But when you have a congregation of 300, 500 suddenly, and you still let people to serve with you, it's a big challenge. It's a dilemma. You're basically facing two bad choices. So that's I can understand why some of them are reluctant to preach, especially when you don't even know how to preach that. Does that make sense?
How missionally engaged are the migrants from mainland China and Hong Kong? Or are they a little too preoccupied or busy with being socialized in their own church communities, or busy in sorting out their problems, settling down, etc.? And they have absolutely no time to think about this large majority of Chinese people, 72%, who are non-Christian, or are they really engaged in reaching out to the so-called non-Christian Chinese?
I would say that there's no simple conclusion to that. There are regional and there are regional differences, and there are also differences between churches. For example, if you look at some Pentecostal churches of Pentecostal background, like Elim and New Life Church in London, bigger city, they are usually more passionate about reaching out. But now it's in the general picture is it's again like the previous picture. It's very hard to gauge at the moment because again, if you have so many people coming into your church, you don't need more people. More people means problem.
But that is from the perspective of the pastors and the leaders. What about the ordinary people? Obviously, that was not part of your research, so I'm not sure if you have an answer. But do you think there's any movement, or even if it is small, being led by Chinese Christians and not necessarily the leaders of the Chinese churches?
Define what you mean by movement. Well, I'm saying
people, getting together, in small groups and going out and reaching out to other Chinese people.
like I said, I think this is pretty much stopped at the moment.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's completely dead, but at least it's halted. Because again, within the church, you have so many people waiting for your ticket. Now, one picture I didn't show is here, because I believe I don't have time. But anyway, I think this is worthwhile showing. So basically, in the 45 church leader interviews, we asked them, what are the emerging, the most immediate, urgent questions you want to deal with. The number one, the larger the world is, the bigger the problem I think it is. The biggest is co-workers. They don't have co-workers. They need workers who work with them. So, and the word outreach didn't even appear in these conversations, which is quite abnormal. If you did it 3 years ago, it might be different results. But now what we worry about is lack of co-workers. Why? Because there are many people from Hong Kong. A huge number of youth coming. Youth is a huge problem. Chinese is facing a more or less a more young problem rather than adult problem. And with all these questions, remain to be answered, to be tackled within the church, the passion for outreach has pretty much stopped within the Chinese church. However, if you're referring to the non-Chinese churches reaching out to Chinese Christians, it's a different story. So we have heard stories in Kent, in Birmingham, where local Anglican ministers try to learn Chinese, and then they can reach to Chinese. So in Tonbridge, Kent, this chief pastor Brian is a huge, great example. He learned Chinese for about 3 months. He will knock at the door of every Chinese family he knew to invite them to the church. So that was a church where it grew from 20, 30 people to now 100.
Oh, wow.
So there are stories not in the Chinese church. Chinese, I think, but for local indigenous churches, because we see blurred boundaries, see more opportunities to welcome people here, and we can see your target audience. Do you trust British people? So there's a huge opportunity.
Okay, Tara,
I have kind of two unrelated questions. The first is in that same stream of where are the clergy of the majority churches, where are they receiving their training, and like what does the pipeline into that look like? And with that same kind of crisis of co-workers, is there a shifting focus to those younger people and looking to recruit and see people called into vocational ministry as well as church planting models? Are they just in panic mode right now? Are they just in survival, but they can't think beyond kind of what's in front of their face, you think? Or do you see some movement towards those kind of strategic those strategies to solve the problems that they're facing every day?
Now, 3 years ago, again, I think COVID-19 is really a watershed event. So before COVID, there's no Chinese theological school in the UK.
Okay.
None. The only Chinese theological school in the UK is in Barcelona, in Europe. Only one. There's actually a distant learning one, but it's not physical. There's no physical reading. Now there are 4 in 2 years.
Okay.
So which means the demand is growing. And the only reason demand growing is you have a larger audience base that they need to be
More
catered.
clients.
Yes, but there are more clients now. That's right. But the other thing about education, there are 2 things. So number one, if you in the 6, if you remember, there's 6 interviews with a lot of educated students. They still, for those who were educated in the UK, they still prefer a local theological school like LST. No brainer, because the level is, I hate to say that, but the quality of education is different, especially if a new theological school built for just 1 year. And you're educated in the UK, you're more likely to choose LST or Nations rather than a new. And the other thing is again, serving is not a very easy thing, especially serving so many people. And in the Chinese churches, it's not well paid. You need to feed your family. So traditionally, one of the hardest sermons pastor, Chinese pastor can preach is about tithing and offering. This is against the norm of the Chinese culture. But interestingly, you will see that the Chinese churches in the UK are struggling with money, whereas the Chinese people's average hourly wage tops the UK. We should be the very richest church in the UK, but in fact, we're the poorest, one of the poorest. So again, it's a mixture of culture, economic, and social issues. But I still see hope, because if you ask the young generations, they're actually more likely to at least to consider taking up a full-time pastoral role in the church, especially in recent years. And one reason that you can see that compared to traditional role of a pastor, there are more ways you can represent yourself, especially when we have social media. We have actually, you remember the 183 accounts. There are more Chinese Christian social media influencers in the UK. They're not necessarily pastors, but they're at least, showing willingness to get engaged. And this is where I guess there are now 4 new Chinese theological schools in the UK. Now, funding is still a problem. Tuition fee is still a problem, but at least we can see the need, demand, or perhaps more important, the supply-demand gap.
go with Leonard next, and then I'll go to Dana, and then to Zach. Yeah.
Okay, yes, sir. I was looking at the biggest lattice co-workers. The shepherds moved with the flock from Hong Kong. In your research, did you look at whether there's a percentage of pastors, co-workers actually moved with the rest of BNO? And if so, it's a matter of time between these co-workers will eventually be absorbed into the local churches, and the problem of co-workers will diminish.
I agree partly 50% of your observation. So yes, shepherds move with flocks. But I would say shepherd moves with flocks and money. Okay, so I think it was a year ago. So when I accessed a WhatsApp group of new Hong Kong, it's a WhatsApp group of 150 Hong Kong Christian workers, pastors, youth coordinators, their teachers. This is basically a group that they share job opportunities together. And COCM, the Chinese Overseas Christian Mission, which is the largest mission organization in the UK, they served as a hub. So basically, they have a large building. They would host newcomers from UK, the Christian leaders. And what they did was, as a hub, they would also serve as a drop center. They would link these pastors with different churches. So when the pastors, when those religious workers, they stayed there, they didn't know where to go. But they would go to that place as long as it's number one, place to serve. Number two, perhaps more importantly, a place that can fund them in their ministry. So they can establish a life here. So in order to serve, you must have a life first. So again, this is a resource problem. So the lack of pastoral resources is linked to not the lack of audience. We have plenty of audience, plenty of clients. It's a lack of funding. And also, I would say, the co-worker doesn't stand alone. So if you see youth, it's not just youth itself as a problem. It's also a problem, lack of youth workers. And Hong Kong is not itself a problem. It's also a problem, lack of workers who can serve the Hong Kong people. So it's co-workers is really the center of everything, the lack of pastoral resources. Again, so for that 150 Christian leaders, most of them would like to serve in the church. That's the reason why they migrate from Hong Kong, because they're worried that they wouldn't be able to serve as was used to serve. So they hope when they're in the UK, they can serve with people, especially knowing there are so many people coming from Hong Kong. So there's a study by Chongji University, Chongji Seminary in Hong Kong. It actually showed that 55 to 30% of Hong Kong migrants are Christian. They label themselves as Christians. And you should remember our graph earlier. In Hong Kong, the average proportion of Christians is only 12%. So we're expecting more Christians coming here. And in COCM, there are many people who moved, many Christian leaders moved with their congregation and can still serve in the congregation. But there are many more people who moved here that they still don't have a place to serve. And another reason is one of the internal conflicts is that when Hong Kong leaders come here, they also brought in the ways of ministry they're familiar with in Hong Kong. So there's actually a culture shock. Should we do the Hong Kong way, do your Hong Kong way, or should I keep our own traditions in our church? And there are conflicts because of that. And within the last 2 years, there are already church splits we can hear. And there are also, stories about pastors being sacked, resigned. And it takes time to integrate them, to really, allow them, the newcomers, to adjust to the British life.
I need to apologize for Norman. I don't know. I had a senior moment. I don't know what Leonard gave. Hey, sorry. Damon, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for this very informative lecture. I'm a Chinese myself, from Hong Kong, came here 46 years ago. My parents were here actually, but unfortunately, both of them passed away. So just to begin with the term NDCCC and ND others. So non-denominational CCC, how is that different from non-denomination others?
Let's go back to this.
Because they form the majority, yeah?
Yeah, well, I sort of classify CCCs and others just to show the difference between CCCs and others, because CCC is usually the first generation churches. So by C others, you can probably see that there are more emerging churches rather than the traditional CCC. So there are more non-denominational churches in the UK in the past few decades. I just want to show the differences. But when it comes to practice and tradition, I would say there are not many differences. So most of them, there are exceptions, of course, but the majority of them, as many Chinese churches here would brand themselves, they will brand themselves as congregational and evangelical, especially evangelical. The mainstream tradition that Chinese churches follow would be evangelical. But it's the main reason I separate these two is to basically show you that there aren't just CCCs at the moment. There are many new churches, non-denominational.
All right. That leads on to my second question, perhaps, a key question for me, because most of the churches, the Chinese churches here are non-denominational. The question is, how do we get a unified effort to deal with the problem of the lack of full-time church worker and full-time youth workers? You mentioned about splits and other things. So can we, if we all belong to one denomination, the bishop come and say, you have a church, a conflict with the bishop come in and sort you out. Again, or we can have a Anglican theological college and everyone will come to our college and sing. So with all this segmentation, the challenge seems to be, how do we have a unified effort to deal with this influx of Christian from Hong Kong and also the mainland Hong Kong, and also I have to mention the British-born Chinese because my son and my daughters are British-born Chinese. Actually, my son, he works for COCM in the English department.
Are you James' dad?
Yes, I am. Yes.
I know.
So how do we get a unified approach to deal with all this problem when we don't actually belong to one denomination?
I might disappoint you. The simple answer is I don't know. And I guess this is also why as part of the British Foreign Bible Society project, we made it very clear that we're not here to provide answers, but more importantly, to provide a platform so we can discuss issues like this, because I have very limited vision on this. But if we can bring in more people to find common grounds, well, there's one common ground at least is we were all Christians. If we can find common grounds and build up things from the things we can agree on, rather than the things we disagree on, because this and that age we almost, personally I feel we focus too much on the things we disagree on. But if we can focus on the things we all think are important, we should deal with, might create a brighter future, I guess.
Let's go with Zeb. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. You had mentioned how when a lot of the immigration happened from Hong Kong, they started maybe for the first time Cantonese language services, which was not the case before. Is there any cases in your study that you came across where there's the working of the two, like originally mainland China and Hong Kong people who would actually form a one church or a common congregation or working together type of movement here, and now that they're no longer attached physically to that?
Now, again, if we go back to history, in the 1990s, if you remember, the first wave of Chinese churches, Mandarin-speaking Chinese churches, when they first emerged, we have to know that most of them were supported by Hong Kong church leaders. Because before 1990, these are mainly Hong Kong churches. So the first generation of major Mandarin-speaking Chinese churches were supported by actually Hong Kong people with Hong Kong background, Cantonese speaking, and somehow, again, that's also the reason why I tend to differentiate new Hong Kong migrants and the older generation. The mindsets are quite different. So for the older ones, they're more likely to focus on harmony, unity, because they are the ones who actually supported the Mandarin, because they treat the Mandarin as a part of the family, focusing mainly on unity rather than the differences. But the new, unfortunately, because of the social issues, they think different. So now, even within the Hong Kong congregation, you can see some level of conflicts between the older generation and the younger generation. And again, if you are a church, a big church in a big city, which you have enough people to sell your church, then it's unity is less of a, because you have enough people to choose from. You don't have to worry about size, you don't have to worry about clients. If you're in a smaller place, like somewhere in Kent, where you have only one small town, 20 Cantonese speaking, 20 Mandarin speaking, then there's no choice. It will be together, and they will work out. I can't tell you how. I've done this research, but if usually it's better if in a place you don't have more choice than one, and it will somehow, some way automatically solve the problem. The problem becomes bigger in terms of the complexity in demographic characteristics.
Let's go with Chris Thornton. Chris, go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Chris, you're muted, so unmute. Is he there?
Coffee.
Hi, Chris. Are you there? Chris Thornton? Oh, not there. I've got a question in terms of, maybe a comment too. Oh, did Chris, is Chris still there or? Okay, one of the things that I found in terms of both the United States and here in the UK is that what you call passive evangelism is actually sort of active passive. Okay. So one of the things that in my studies has shown that Chinese immigrants and people coming to the UK would prefer to go to a place like church to meet people than say to a bar. Okay. Western society may be more comfortable going down and checking out the local action downtown on a Friday night, that kind of thing, to meet some people. That's not typical for within Chinese culture. In fact, it would be a very uneasy experience to be hanging out in a bar. That's not seen as decent behavior. The other thing that I have found is that Chinese churches are very good, and a lot of them are, the good ones are very good at welcoming the newcomer. So like even at OCTC, you guys always take time to introduce whoever's visiting. And then there's people who come up and shake their hands and greet them. So immediately you feel part of something. So it may seem passive, it seems a little bit active for me. But the other question I was really curious about is baptism. Did you do any research to find out who joining churches in the UK are already baptized? How many are not baptized when they join the church, and how many actually go through with baptism? Because I know in Singapore, a real watershed, even for those that are attending for a long time, is when they come forward for actual baptism. Some people will attend church for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, and see themselves as part of the congregation before going to baptism. And baptism really sinks the root. So,
yeah. So, first question, and I think passive evangelism. What I want to focus is on the structural arrangements of a church where you don't have to, do much outreaching ministry to receive new comers, but they keep coming anyway. But yeah, I think it's pretty like our church. When people really comes, we would actually track them, how well they're doing. But I guess the logic or the penny logic about choosing a church is quite rational. So it's almost a rational choice. Typically, if a Hong Kong migrant come to UK, church is definitely one of the probably the most important place he can he or she can find help. Church is the only place you can, get free, unconditional help and love, support you get. And, if you want to leave, you just leave. And most of them come, remember, they don't just end up in one church. They will basically shop around. And the questions you get from them is not, wow, Jesus, great. Tell me more about him. Most questions asked will be, oh, do you know where can I rent a cheaper house? How can I register with the NHS? Where can I find a better school for my child, which is the better school area? These questions are more common, and you don't just get these from one church. Usually what you see experience from a newcomers, also represented in our focus groups, is that they will just shop around. They'll go to 10, not 10, 4 or 5 churches. It's very common. So one of the families I spoke with here, she's been synodate, Synapse, OCCC, OCGC, at least 4 of them. And eventually she decided to stay in Synapse because they have a better arrangements for the children, different children activities. So I would say it's part of rational choice, because you can optimize your experience and capitalize the church experience from the moment you spend in church. Some, might like music, it's more healing music, rather, more Chinese people are likely to, it's part of a research, could basically ask, what would you like to explore more about Christianity, and what supplement you use to help you in your Bible engagement in quiet times. Many mention music. It's usually, it's a long neglected issue in the Chinese. We don't care about music, not only in the church, of course. We're not that talented. But anyway, because people now care more about music. And I think this is really, new challenges and for the Chinese church. Sorry, what's the second question?
Baptisms.
Oh, yes, that's one of my favorite questions to answer. Yes, so like all transnational churches, Chinese church is typical in the sense that it's, especially in this era, it's very, very strong in accepting Christians who were already Christians when they arrived in the UK. So if you typically look at Chinese church, one issue that Chinese church has been facing pre-pandemic is that it's very weak in terms of generating new Christians. So what happened with that? It's because remember, it's a migrant church, and because selective migration and the structure of the church has very much to do with visa policies of that era. So say 10 years ago, when I arrived in the UK, there's no what we call PSW, post-work visa, post-study visa, post-study work visa, which means after I finish my studies, I would just leave. For most of Chinese students here, it's just 1 year MSc program. You just have 1 year. Evangelism window is just for 1 year to get someone baptized. All right. So of course it's very challenging rather than if someone's coming from China already baptized. So it's always, many more people who are already baptized from, outside when they came to the country. Now it's changing a little bit because after a few years, I think it's in 2017, they resumed PSW. So at that time, you can see more and more Chinese students got baptized from 17 to 19. And then of course, COVID, and everything stopped. But now, and because there are many people coming here, we can see 2 stories. And number one, there are more Christians coming outside the UK, fill the churches, Chinese church in the UK. There are more people getting baptized in the UK because more, you have a larger base to have those who get baptized. But if you compare the numbers on a relative sense, for example, in a year, how many of you got baptized? How many of you are Christians coming from the UK? It's always many, many more from outside. Mature Christians from outside rather than homegrown Christians. Another figure might be interesting is that if you ask the youth workers in the UK, ask a couple of COCM youth workers, not also those in CCIL. If you still have contacts with your youngsters, how many of them are still going to church after they graduated from your youth group? Are they still coming to church now they're in college? The answer is about 2/3 of them never went to church again. So it's very similar. So if you read this next generation report from Barna Group in America, very similar number. There's another very great book by David Kahneman. It's called You Lost Me, where they did the same sort of research in America. Amazingly, the numbers were quite similar if you look at the Chinese church. Although I haven't done really rigorous surveys or systematic studies on them, but we can suspect that losing Christians is not a white British problem, American problem. It's happening across all churches.
We have one last question, and that will be Chris. If you're there, unmute and ask your question, Chris.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for the lecture. Just a bit of background on me. I'm from the UK, but I've been in Hong Kong for 11 years. I came back last year. My wife's from Hong Kong, I was pastoring in Hong Kong. So we come back, we studied a ministry here, trying to reach out as well to some of the new arrivals. One of the things when I was in Hong Kong, was very cognizant of was we were in an international church, but a lot of the youth were draining out of the local churches there. And many of them were actually coming to English-speaking international churches if they were going anywhere. And so over here, I guess, I'm in an English-speaking church. We've got various mostly Cantonese-speaking people coming, but actually, what do you see just from some of your research? You've obviously talked about the welcome churches. You talked about some of the UK Hong Kong churches. Do you see a place for English-speaking churches in helping and partnering together with Chinese churches with this? It's something that I was trying to do when I was in Hong Kong, but I would love to hear your thoughts and what have you seen from your research, and where do you see, as you've been talking about some of the resource lacks and those different things, ways forward with that? Yeah.
I mean, thank you. I think great question, and you can actually see from we have actually growing hard evidence showing this is actually not only the space for collaboration. Collaboration is actually an ongoing issue, because here, for example, the OCCC, the Oxford Chinese Christian Church, has been supported by Synapse. It's a typical example that a local Chinese church can be supported by a local non-Chinese church. And there are, I came across examples in London, in Birmingham, especially in youth ministry. It's easier because when you talk about youth ministry in Chinese church, it's quite unique, because it's almost like it's actually not a Chinese ministry. It's more like an intercultural ministry. Because remember, out of the very day the youth are in your church, Monday to Friday they're in a local British school. They speak English, they have English friends. The more gradually they would more used to this British setting rather than Chinese. So, for example, CCIL is hiring the local British youth minister, and examples like this are just increasing. We have remember Glasgow, Birmingham, Sheffield, all these Chinese churches actually hired British English-speaking pastors who speaks no Chinese at all. And this is more like a tendency, because and Chinese Christianity is not a big circle, because everyone's copying what the others are doing. We learn from each other's mistakes, and we learn, when someone, like in the case of youth ministry, we see the benefits of hiring English-speaking youth pastors. Everyone is copying these practices. So I think, there's definitely space for collaboration. And youth ministry is a typical common ground that both Chinese churches and local indigenous churches can explore together.
Well, good. Let's put our hands together. I just an announcement in that next week we have Kalita Chu, who's she's going to be giving a lecture in terms of Hong Kong Chinese evangelism and the Book of Numbers, which will be interesting. And we're also going to have after that Maureen Yeo, who's going to look at actually the development of seminaries here in the UK Chinese seminaries to meet this very need. My own lecture is going to be delayed because I had to give up a slot for someone who's scheduled, but I will give mine later. I'm going to look at the dynamics of this for China, because one of the things, one of the reasons people are a bit nervous, including China, is this massive group of people who are leaving China tend to set up relationships later on with business back and forth. So the overseas Chinese and Chinese student represent within even Marxist thinking what we call a contradiction, in the sense that these are people that are not easily controlled, but necessary for the development of China itself. And that represents all kinds of implications for missions and evangelism, but also China's relationship to both Christians here in UK, in the United States. In fact, one of the things I know that they were talking about distrust. One of the issues is China actually have, this is in the New York Times, does send over agents to check up on Christians in the UK, in the United States. One of the good news about that is many of them become Christians. So,
Always good to know.
but that's a common practice. Anyway, thank you for being here. Excellent.
Thank you for having me.
I would very much appreciate you. So thank you. Good.